Welcome, dear listener. You found your way once again to Sleepy Historian, where the stories of the past drift gently into the present, carried not with urgency or excitement, but with a quiet calm that invites rest. This is boring history for sleep, a place where ancient lives unfold at a measured pace, where time stretches long, and where the telling of the past becomes soft-spoken history documentary, designed not to quicken your thoughts, but to ease them into stillness. If this kind of bedtime relaxation and soft storytelling helps you unwind, you might consider liking this video or subscribing to the channel, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you feel comfortable, let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. There is something strangely comforting in imagining others spread across the night, in many places at many hours, falling asleep to the same gentle narration, carried together by calm bedtime storytelling. So settle in, dim the lights, let your breath fall into rhythm. Let the simple sound of words create the background hum of comfort. Tonight's story drifts northward, across seas marked by longships and horizons crowned with forests and fjords. Tonight we look, with steady and patient eyes, at what life was really like for Viking women. This will not be the tale of warriors alone, nor the clash of sword and shield, though such things shaped the backdrop of their world. Instead, we will listen closely to the quieter details, the rhythm of their lives and households both humble and noble, the patterns of weaving and cooking, the influence of belief and ritual, and the contrast between daily labors and the positions of prestige some women held. Over the course of this history sleep story, we will move through 4 gentle chapters. First, we will step into the everyday lives of Viking women, imagining the texture of their homes and the cadence of their days. Then, we will linger on the story of one figure, a woman remembered by history or saga, her life a thread in the greater tapestry of the Norse world. From there, we will turn toward the mysteries of archaeology and culture, seeing what the soil and artifacts whisper about women's roles, what is revealed and what remains unsolved. And finally, we will shift to the social contrasts, from the bondswomen who labored under the weight of service, to the women of chieftain households whose presence shaped alliances and wealth. Through each segment, the tone remains gentle and detached, inviting you to listen without effort. If you find your mind wandering, that is welcome. If sleep comes before the end, that is even better. So, let us begin the long voyage together. Imagine the flicker of a hearth fire, the hush of night over a northern village, and the quiet strength of women whose lives, woven into sagas, households, and history, still linger like distant echoes. This is relaxing history to fall asleep to. This is calm narration of a world both familiar and strange. This is boring history for sleep. Imagine yourself stepping into a Viking settlement, not in the midst of battle or raid, but in the stillness of ordinary life. It is early morning, the air cool and heavy with mist. The long northern night has just surrendered to the pale wash of dawn. Smoke rises in slow spirals from the turf-roofed longhouses, carrying with it the scent of peat, wood, and the faint tang of drying fish. It is here, among these households, that Viking women shaped the rhythm of each day. A longhouse is not a grand palace, but it is the center of family and labor. Step inside, and you find its walls lined with benches, furs draped across them for warmth. At the far end glows the hearth, its embers coaxed back into flame by careful hands. The hearth is not simply for heat. It is the heartbeat of the home, the place where food is prepared, where stories are told, where children linger close during the long winters. Viking women tended this fire constantly, for hearth gone cold meant not only discomfort, but risk to the entire family. The day begins with tasks both humble and necessary. A woman lifts a clay vessel, pours water into a wooden trough, and begins to knead coarse bread. The flour comes from barley, ground by hand on heavy querns that leave a fine dust upon the skin. She works slowly, methodically, shaping loaves that will be baked on hot stones. Outside, another woman tends to the livestock, milking goats, checking the thatch of the barn, brushing snow, or dew from the backs of the animals. The smell of hay, damp and earthy, mixes with the crisp air. These details, repetitive and enduring, mark the steady cadence of Viking women's labor. Weaving, too, was central to their lives. The loom stood tall within the longhouse, a frame of wood weighted with stones that kept threads taut. Imagine the sound of shuttle against thread, a gentle rhythm that filled the hours. Wool from sheep, spun by hand into yarn, became cloth dyed with plant-based colors, soft browns, muted greens, deep blues extracted from wood. Each garment was a testimony to patience. The sagas speak of warriors' bravery, but without women's weaving, there would have been no cloaks against the cold, no sails to carry longships across the sea. Children clustered near their mothers, imitating the motions of grinding, weaving, or stirring pots of broth thick with barley and onions. In these households, learning was not in formal lessons, but in the imitation of daily work. A daughter might carefully mimic her mother's hands as they stitched. A son might learn to mend nets or feed animals. The family unit was a workshop of survival, and women were the quiet instructors of its continuity. Even leisure was practical. Women gathered to spin yarn while sharing news of kin or reciting half-remembered verses of sagas. The line between labor and rest blurred, for tasks were constant, yet voices made them lighter. On long winter nights, the flicker of the fire cast shadows on walls where stories of gods and heroes were retold, not as entertainment alone, but as a thread binding generations together. Food preparation filled much of each day. Barley bread, butter, cheese, dried fish, and sometimes meat formed the staples. Viking women preserved food by drying or smoking, ensuring survival through harsh seasons. The scent of smoke lingered on clothing, woven into the fabric of life itself. Honey sweetened what little could be sweetened, and ale brewed in barrels provided safe drink. These quiet, constant tasks may appear dull to us now, but in their steadiness lay the security of family and clan. To step back from this picture is to see the quiet strength of women as the anchor of Viking households. Their work was not a single role, but a weaving together of countless duties: tending hearths, preserving food, clothing families, raising children, sustaining farms, and maintaining the rhythm of life. Where sagas sing of voyages and raids, it is here, in the unbroken continuity of daily tasks, that much of Viking endurance truly rested. And as the sun rose higher, and the mist gave way to pale northern light, the settlement stirred with activity. Men may have set out to sea or labored in fields, but behind them always remained the women, their labor less heralded, yet no less essential. The rhythm of their lives, repeated across countless days, formed the true heartbeat of the Viking world. As the morning hours deepen into the full light of day, the rhythm of Viking women's tasks expands beyond the hearth and the loom. Picture the settlement now more awake. Men working in fields, tending boats, or preparing for travel, while women continue to weave together the threads of everyday survival. Their responsibilities were layered, shifting with the season, the weather, and the fortunes of their families. In summer, the fields demanded attention. Viking women bent to gather herbs used for both food and medicine, their baskets filling with wild onions, sorrel, or yarrow. They also planted and harvested crops, barley and rye being most common. Imagine the feel of soil crumbling between their fingers, the low hum of bees moving through wildflowers along the edges of the fields, and the sound of children playing nearby while their mothers bent to the earth. The labor was constant, but it carried its own quiet rhythm, marked by the turning of the seasons. Seasonality shaped nearly every task. In winter, households turned inward. Long dark nights meant weaving, storytelling, and mending tools by the fire. Women stitched garments from thick wool, lined cloaks with fur, and repaired nets or ropes. The sound of iron tools being sharpened mingled with the soft voices of song or prayer. In spring, there was fresh labor, tending young animals, repairing fences, and preparing the soil once again. Every season brought repetition, yet also its own distinctive work, like beads strung in a pattern that only made sense across a whole year. Beyond farming and weaving, Viking women were keepers of knowledge. They preserved methods of dyeing, brewing, and healing. Simple herbs like chamomile, juniper, and thyme were gathered not only for flavor, but for easing illness. Picture a woman preparing a warm herbal drink for a coughing child, her movements steady, her voice low. In these quiet gestures lived the unwritten medicine of her world. Fragile knowledge passed from mother to daughter, never recorded in books, but inscribed in memory and practice. Animals, too, shaped much of daily work. Cows provided milk for cheese and butter, while sheep gave wool for clothing. Goats, hardy and nimble, grazed along rocky slopes. Their milk turned to soft cheeses. Women tended these creatures patiently, leading them to pasture, collecting milk with practiced hands, and ensuring their survival through harsh winters. Each animal was part of the household's wealth, and its care often rested on women's shoulders. Domestic life extended into social life. Women hosted travelers, prepared food for feasts, and maintained the honor of their households through hospitality. To offer bread, ale, and a seat by the fire was not merely kindness. It was a duty. A woman's ability to provide well for guests reflected the strength of her family and the prosperity of her home. Thus, even the act of stirring a pot of stew or setting out carved wooden cups carried symbolic weight. The material world of Viking women was simple, yet meaningful. Their tools were carved from wood or bone, their vessels shaped from clay, their jewelry often modest, bronze brooches fastening woolen dresses, strings of beads offering color amid muted garments. A woman's clothing marked her status. A free woman's dress might be adorned with fine brooches, while a bondswoman's attire was plain and unadorned. Yet in both cases, the garments spoke of labor, wool sheared, spun, dyed, and woven, each step requiring countless hours. Imagine a midday meal in such a household. Bread, cheese, dried fish, perhaps a small portion of meat from a pig slaughtered in autumn. Ale poured into wooden cups. The hearth glowing, children sitting cross-legged, voices mingling. Outside, the air carries the scent of salt from the fjord. Boats creak against the shore. The sounds of hammers and axes echo faintly in the distance, blending with the quieter sounds of daily work. These are not the details sung by skalds or written into sagas, yet they were the substance of life. Viking women were not only companions to men of voyages and raids. They were the keepers of the home, the unseen strength that sustained whole communities. Their daily lives may seem ordinary, even dull, yet it is within this ordinariness that survival was possible. The loom, the hearth, the fields, the animals, all of these tasks performed without flourish, were as vital to Viking society as the oars of the longship. As afternoon stretches on, the settlement hums with this activity, neither hurried nor idle. Each gesture, each chore, is a part of the ongoing rhythm of life, repeated across years, shaping generations. The sagas may have left these details in shadow, but in truth, they form the clearest picture of what Viking life truly was. A life of constant, quiet endurance, shaped by the steady labor of women. As the afternoon begins its slow descent toward evening, the pace of the settlement softens but does not truly rest. In the Viking world, leisure was always woven into labor, and even moments of quiet held echoes of work. Women, having tended to animals and prepared meals, often returned to the loom or spindle, their hands in constant motion even as their voices turned to conversation. Picture a woman seated near the doorway of a longhouse, light falling across her lap as she twists wool into thread. The spindle whirls gently between her fingers, the rhythm as steady as breathing. Around her, other women sit with similar tasks, each contributing to the endless cycle of weaving and mending. This was not work done in solitude alone. It was communal, social, and generational. Older women taught younger ones, their patience extending not only to the threads they spun, but to the shaping of skills that would sustain families for decades. In these hours, storytelling also flourished. The sagas, as later recorded, were shaped in such circles, tales of gods and giants, heroes and voyages. Yet just as important were smaller stories, family histories, warnings disguised as fables, lessons carried in metaphor. A woman might recite a story of Odin's search for wisdom while her hands spun yarn, her voice blending with the faint sounds of livestock outside. The children listening might half understand, half dream, the cadence of words imprinting themselves even as their minds wandered. Evening also brought a time for gathering resources. Women ventured to the shoreline to collect driftwood, seaweed, or shellfish. Others moved into the forest edges, where berries grew thick in summer and where firewood could be gathered for the long winter nights. Imagine the cool air carrying the scent of salt and pine, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the muted call of seabirds returning to their nests. These simple journeys into the landscape tied women closely to their environment, their lives attuned to the natural world's offerings and demands. The home itself required constant care. Roofs of turf and timber needed patching. Floors of packed earth required sweeping. Tools had to be stored carefully to avoid rust or rot. A woman might spend part of her evening repairing clothing, smoothing rough spots on a loom, or tightening the cords of a storage chest. Each gesture, though small, reinforced the resilience of the household. As dusk deepened, the settlement turned once more toward the hearth. Dinner was prepared, perhaps a stew of fish, onions, and barley, or meat stewed slowly with root vegetables. The scent filled the longhouse, mingling with smoke that curled upward through the roof's opening. By now, the fire burned more brightly, its glow illuminating the carved beams and shadowed corners. Women portioned out the food with care, ensuring each member of the family was fed. The longhouse grew lively with voices during these meals. Children recounted small adventures of the day. Men spoke of work completed or journeys planned, and women listened while keeping the flow of food and drink steady. Hospitality extended even here. A guest arriving at dusk would be welcomed, seated, and offered sustenance. The honor of a family depended on such acts of generosity, and women ensured it was upheld. After the meal, the household did not simply fall into sleep. There was still work, though quieter, repairing nets, carving wooden utensils, or preparing yarn for the next day. By the firelight, women's hands moved with practiced ease, their gestures steady even after hours of labor. Children drifted towards slumber on benches covered with furs, their small breaths blending with the crackle of firewood. Night settled gently over the settlement. Outside, the fjord lay still beneath the stars, and the dark silhouettes of longships rocked faintly against the tide. Inside, the glow of hearths persisted, a constant beacon against the long northern darkness. Viking women, at the close of each day, ensured that flame and family both endured into tomorrow. The rhythm of such evenings was not dramatic. It was repetitive, steady, even monotonous by modern eyes. Yet in that monotony lay survival, and in that survival lay continuity. Without the unbroken labor of women, day after day, season after season, the Viking world could not have endured. These tasks, these quiet rituals, were the foundation upon which sagas of voyages and battles were built. Thus the day closes as it began, with the steady glow of the hearth, the hum of voices, and the unseen strength of women's labor, holding together the fragile threads of life in a harsh northern world. History often remembers the Vikings through the sagas of kings and warriors. Yet women, too, appear in these stories, not always at the forefront, but as figures of quiet power or as remembered names in poetry and law. To bring this into focus, let us turn to one woman whose life has been traced through both history and legend, Udi, the deep-minded. Her name suggests wisdom, and indeed her life reveals a kind of resilience that was neither loud nor easily forgotten. She lived during the 9th century, a time when Viking communities stretched from Norway to the Scottish Isles and onward to Iceland and beyond. While exact details blur across centuries, what is remembered paints a portrait of a woman who balanced loss with leadership and who carried her family across seas to new lands. AUD was born into a world of shifting fortunes. Her father, Kettle Flatnose, was a chieftain who established himself in the Hebrides, the islands off the coast of Scotland. In that rugged place, Udi married Olaf the White, a Norse Gael king of Dublin. Together they lived at the crossroads of cultures, Norse seafarers mingling with Gaelic traditions, alliances forming and dissolving like the tides. Yet her life was not untouched by sorrow. Her husband, remembered as a warrior king, died in battle. Her son, Thorstein the Red, grew into power but met a similar fate, cut down while still young. For many women, such losses would have meant retreat into obscurity, but AUD's story did not end there. Instead, she became the center of her family's survival. After Thorstein's death, Udi gathered her kin, her followers, and her household. Imagine her, a woman now advanced in years, yet with determination clear in her bearing. She ordered the building of a ship, not a warship, but a vessel meant to carry people across vast seas. With this ship, she set sail for Iceland, guiding her family and retainers to a new home. The voyage itself is not described in vivid detail by the sagas, but one may imagine its challenges. The North Atlantic was no gentle expanse. Its winds cut cold, its waves rose high. Yet EUD endured it, not as a warrior with sword in hand, but as a leader ensuring her people reached safe shores. When they arrived in Iceland, she claimed land for her kin, distributing it with fairness, and establishing households that would flourish long after her death. In Icelandic tradition, land-taking was a solemn and practical act. Stones might be raised, boundaries marked, rivers and hillsides named. AUD is remembered for giving generous allotments, ensuring her followers were provided for. She founded a settlement in Vam, in western Iceland, where her descendants would become prominent figures in saga literature. The memory of EUD lingers not in tales of conquest, but in the quieter strength of guidance. She hosted large feasts, even in her final years, honoring kinship ties and ensuring her family's place in society. It is said she died seated at such a gathering, her dignity preserved to the last. Her story illustrates how Viking women could hold power, not always through warfare, but through land, leadership, and legacy. She is remembered as one of the great matriarchs of Iceland, her wisdom earning her the epithet the deep-minded. And so, when we picture Viking women, it is worth remembering figures like AUD, not cloaked in battle, but draped in patience and resolve, not forgotten in the margins of sagas, but carried forward in the memory of generations who trace their heritage to her settlements. Her biography, though softened by centuries of retelling, offers a glimpse into the possibilities of women's lives in a world often imagined as solely masculine. It shows that women could command ships, claim land, and shape the destiny of families. And while many women lived quieter lives of hearth and farm, the story of ED reminds us that women's influence stretched further than the smoke of longhouses, reaching even into the shaping of entire communities. AUD, the deep-minded, was not alone in being remembered by history. While she represents wisdom and leadership, other Viking women's names surface in fragments, some in sagas, others in chronicles, still others in archaeology. Their stories, often half-lit by legend, give us glimpses of how women could act with independence, and sometimes with remarkable courage. Among them is Freydis Eriksdottir, the daughter of Eric the Red and sister to Leif Erikson, the explorer who reached Vinland, believed to be in North America. Freydis appears in the Vinland sagas, her role both controversial and compelling. Her story unfolds not in the fields of Iceland, but across the wide Atlantic, in lands new to Norse explorers. The sagas recount that Freydis accompanied voyages to Vinland, sometimes alongside her brothers. One story, told in the saga of the Greenlanders, places her in the midst of conflict with the indigenous peoples encountered there. According to the tale, when Norse men retreated in fear, Freydis stood her ground. Heavily pregnant at the time, she seized a weapon and struck her chest with it, crying out to frighten the attackers. Whether or not this detail is literal truth, it paints a picture of her as a woman of defiance, unafraid to take her place in a perilous moment. Yet Freydis is not remembered only for courage. Another saga, the saga of Eric the Red, portrays her in a darker light, scheming against companions on a later voyage, leading to betrayal and violence. Here, she becomes a figure of ambition and ruthlessness. Between these conflicting accounts lies uncertainty. Was she a heroine, a villain, or simply a woman whose actions unsettled the expectations of her time? What is clear is that Freydis was not confined to the hearth. She was present in voyages, in decisions, in moments of both risk and opportunity. Her presence in the sagas, though colored by exaggeration, reveals that women were acknowledged as actors in the great journeys of the Norse. She is remembered not as a passive companion, but as a figure capable of altering events. The sagas themselves are a blend of memory and imagination. They were written down centuries after the events they describe, shaped by the biases of their tellers. Yet even if Freydis' actions were magnified or distorted, the very fact of her inclusion tells us something. In the Norse imagination, women could stand at the center of events and could embody qualities of bravery, cunning, or ambition normally reserved for men. The contrast between AUD and Freydis is striking. AUD's story is one of resilience, leadership, and community building. Freydis' is one of daring and defiance, even controversy. Together, they remind us that Viking women, like all people, cannot be reduced to a single role. Some preserved households, others led migrations, still others stood on the edges of exploration. Beyond these named figures, countless unnamed women shaped the Viking Age. Their voices are silent in the sagas, yet their presence is felt. Archaeologists uncover brooches, spindle whorls, and household tools buried beside women in graves. These objects, simple though they seem, are testimonies to lives of steady labor, of craft, of resilience. Some graves, however, hold surprises, such as weapons buried alongside women, suggesting roles that do not fit neatly into assumptions. These mysteries remind us that the lives of Viking women were varied, their possibilities broader than the neat categories of later historians. Returning to Freydis, her tale offers a glimpse into the tensions of exploration. Imagine the vast Atlantic crossing, the uncertainty of new shores, the harshness of survival in unfamiliar lands. For a woman to assert herself in that setting, whether as a leader, a fighter, or an instigator, was to step into spaces often reserved for men. That her story was remembered at all suggests her actions left an impression strong enough to endure across centuries. In this way, the sagas offer both truth and reflection. They tell us as much about what Viking society valued, or feared, in women as they do about the women themselves. A wise matriarch like EUD was honored. A bold figure like Freydis was both celebrated and criticized. Through their remembered lives, we glimpse the spectrum of possibilities for women in Norse society. And so, in the quiet retelling of these biographies, we find balance. Viking women were not merely silent figures at the edge of sagas. They were, at times, leaders, voyagers, and even disruptors of order, whether shaping households or daring to confront enemies. Their lives wove into the broader tapestry of the Viking world, leaving threads that remain visible even now. As the sagas remind us, not every remembered Viking woman was a queenly figure, nor an explorer across oceans. Some appear in the chronicles of foreign lands, where their presence startled outsiders, leaving written traces that now serve as rare glimpses into their lives. One such glimpse comes from the accounts of travelers and merchants who encountered Norse people in Eastern Europe and beyond. In these records, Viking women appear not only as wives or companions, but as participants in long-distance journeys that connected Scandinavia with the rivers of Rus, the markets of Constantinople, and the distant edges of the known world. While men often received attention as raiders or traders, women were there too, sometimes as settlers, sometimes as merchants in their own right. One striking account comes from the Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who observed the Rus, a Norse people living along the Volga River in the early 10th century. His description is vivid, though colored by his own cultural lens. Among his observations is a description of funerary rites for a chieftain. In his telling, women were central to the ceremony. One, in particular, played a powerful role, referred to by Ibn Fadlan as the Angel of Death. She presided over rituals, organized preparations, and carried out actions that were both sacred and grim. This woman, unnamed in his account, appears as a ritual specialist, a figure of both reverence and fear. Whether she was a seeress, a priestess, or a woman chosen for the role, she embodied authority in that moment. Ibn Fadlan describes how she orchestrated offerings, guided attendants, and eventually took part in the sacrifice that accompanied the burial. His words are unsettling to modern readers, but they reveal that in the Norse imagination, women could hold roles of spiritual and ritual significance. Other sources, both archaeological and literary, suggest that such ritual women were not uncommon. In Old Norse tradition, the Volva, or seeress, held a respected place. She was believed to possess knowledge of fate, the ability to foresee events, and the skill to perform ceremonies that bridged the human and the divine. The sagas sometimes describe Volar traveling between households, sought out for their wisdom and feared for their power. They carried staffs, wore distinctive clothing, and commanded both respect and apprehension. In burial sites across Scandinavia, archaeologists have uncovered graves of women with staffs, amulets, and objects interpreted as ritual tools. These graves are often rich, suggesting that such women held high status. The material evidence resonates with the literary image, women who walked in the liminal space between daily life and the unseen world. When we place Ibn Fadlan's account beside the archaeological record, the picture deepens. Viking women were not only weavers, mothers, or settlers. Some were guardians of belief, interpreters of destiny, and leaders in rituals that shaped how communities understood life and death. The presence of such women underscores the diversity of roles open to them. It is important to move slowly here, to acknowledge that much remains uncertain. Ibn Fadlan wrote as an outsider, interpreting through his own perspective. The sagas, written centuries later, shaped memory through literary imagination. Archaeology offers artifacts, but not always clear answers. Yet together, these threads suggest that Viking women could stand at the heart of ritual life, their authority extending beyond the household into the spiritual fabric of society. To imagine such a woman, picture her seated at the edge of a gathering, her staff across her knees, her eyes heavy with the weight of prophecy. Around her, people fall silent, waiting for her words. She is not a warrior, nor a queen, yet she holds power all her own, the power of belief, of knowledge, of mystery. In a world where the future was uncertain, and where fate was thought to be woven by unseen hands, her voice carried weight. Just as Udi, the deep-minded shaped settlements, and Freydis Eriksdottir stood defiant in voyages, so too did the Volva, or ritual leader, stand in her own sphere of influence. Her story may be less personal, less tied to a single name, yet it is no less revealing. Through her, we see another dimension of what it meant to be a woman in the Viking Age. These remembered figures, whether legendary or historical, expand the narrow picture often painted of Viking women. They were not all confined, nor were they all celebrated. Some are practical leaders, others controversial adventurers, and others mysterious keepers of ritual. Together, they remind us that women's roles in Norse society were layered, varied, and sometimes surprising. And so, as we bring this biographical section to a close, we hold on to three distinct images: the wise AD, the fierce Freydis, and the shadow Volva. Each represents a different path, a different possibility within the Viking world. Each, in her own way, shows that the lives of Viking women cannot be reduced to simplicity. Their stories, faint though they may be, ripple across time, quiet echoes that still reach us now. When we turn from the sagas to the soil, we enter another kind of storytelling. Archaeology whispers where manuscripts fall silent. The ground itself, layered with centuries of use, carries fragments of how Viking women lived, worked, and were remembered. To walk through the evidence is to tread slowly, piece by piece, assembling a picture that is both partial and profound. One of the most remarkable sources of knowledge about Viking women comes from their graves. Burial was not only a practical act, but also a cultural statement, a way of expressing identity, belief, and social standing. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have uncovered resting places that range from the simplest earth mounds to elaborate ship burials. Each carries meaning, and many belong to women. Imagine standing at the edge of such a site. The mound is low, softened by grass and time. Beneath lies a wooden chamber, or perhaps the hollowed-out shell of a boat, carefully arranged to carry the departed into the next realm. Within, the remains rest alongside objects, beads strung in bright patterns, keys that once jingled at the waist, spindle whorls worn smooth from use, and sometimes weapons, tools, or imported treasures. These are not merely possessions, but signals, chosen to accompany the individual, to mark status, to reflect identity in death as in life. One of the most discussed discoveries is the Oseberg burial in Norway, dated to the early 9th century. Within a richly decorated ship lay 2 women, buried with an astonishing collection of goods. Carved sleighs, ornate wooden chests, tapestries, textiles, and even household tools surrounded them. The wealth of the burial suggests high status, and scholars continue to debate who these women were. Some propose that one was a queen or noblewoman, the other perhaps her companion or attendant. Others see echoes of ritual, suggesting one might have been a vulva, a seeress. The Oseberg burial reminds us of how layered Viking women's lives could be. The artistry of the wooden carvings, the detail of the tapestries, and the variety of the grave goods speak not only of wealth, but of cultural sophistication. It challenges the oversimplified image of Vikings as purely rough, seafaring raiders. Instead, it shows a society where women could be honored in death with ceremony as grand as any warriors. And yet, mysteries remain. The bones of the women were poorly preserved, leaving more questions than answers. Who were they? How did they live? What roles did they play? Were they mother and daughter, noblewoman and priestess, or something else entirely? The silence of the grave resists certainty. Beyond Oseberg, many smaller but equally telling graves expand the story. Some women were buried with simple sets of household tools, an iron knife, a spindle, a few beads, suggesting lives of steady domestic rhythm. Others had keys, which in Viking society carried symbolic weight. To hold the household keys was to hold authority over stores, goods, and the ordering of domestic life. In sagas and in graves, keys appear again and again, small but meaningful emblems of responsibility and respect. In some graves, exotic objects appear: glass beads from the south, coins from distant markets, silk from the east. These finds suggest that Viking women were not confined to isolated villages, but were part of a wide-reaching network of trade. Even if they did not sail themselves, their households received and displayed goods that had traveled thousands of miles. There are also graves where women were laid to rest with weapons. These have provoked intense debate. Are these genuine indications of warrior women, or symbolic inclusions chosen for ritual or honor? One of the most famous cases is the Birka grave in Sweden, where a skeleton long thought to be a male warrior was later determined, through DNA analysis, to be female. The burial contained a full set of weapons and 2 horses, suggesting the status of a high-ranking fighter. Scholars continue to debate whether this represents a true warrior woman or reflects symbolic practices. Regardless, it adds texture to our understanding of women's possible roles in Viking society. To move slowly through these graves is to feel both closeness and distance. The objects are familiar: tools, clothing, jewelry. yet the meanings they carried may not align perfectly with ours. A spindle may seem humble, but in a world where textiles were vital for trade, warmth, and wealth, it was a symbol of central importance. A bead may seem decorative, yet its origin could trace back to distant lands, carrying silent stories of connection. Archaeology does not always answer. More often, it leaves us with careful possibilities, layered interpretations. Still, these burials show us that Viking women occupied varied places in their world. Some lived simply, others with grandeur. Some were domestic managers, others ritual specialists, and perhaps some, even warriors. The soil preserves what stories forget. In its patient silence, it gives us glimpses into the mystery of Viking women's lives. Objects rest where hands once held them. Clothing fragments linger where they once wrapped bodies. Ships remain where once they carried honor into the earth. And from these fragments, we listen slowly, gently, to what history allows us to hear. Beyond the graves and burial ships, another dimension of Viking women's lives emerges from the fragments of everyday objects scattered through archaeological sites. These are the quiet remnants of activity. The worn stone of a quern used for grinding grain, the iron knife dulled by years of cutting, the bone needle smoothed by constant sewing. Each small artifact seems simple, but together they create a vivid picture of rhythms that once filled Viking households. Textiles, in particular, speak volumes. Archaeologists often find spindle whorls, loom weights, and fragments of cloth in settlements and graves alike. In the Viking Age, textile production was not a mere domestic chore. It was a cornerstone of the economy. Cloth was necessary for clothing, sails, and trade. A well-made woolen cloak or finely woven linen could be exchanged for silver or goods across vast distances. Women who produced these textiles held essential knowledge: how to spin fibers evenly, how to weave strong and even cloth, how to dye fabrics with plants in the subtle shades of blue, green, or red. Imagine a Viking longhouse in winter. The loom stands tall against the wall, threads stretched in vertical lines, the rhythmic beat of the weaver's sword creating a steady sound. A woman, or perhaps several women together, move carefully, their fingers deftly guiding threads, their conversation quiet but steady. The fire flickers in the center of the room, casting warm light across their work. The product of these hours is not only clothing, but wealth itself, fabric that might later travel far from home. Archaeology supports this image. In Hedeby, an important trading settlement, and in Burka, excavations have revealed tools, dye pots, and finished textiles that show remarkable skill. Some textiles even bear pattern designs, suggesting that artistry and creativity mingled with practicality. Viking women were not simply keeping their families warm. They were artisans, and their products carried social and economic value. Another recurring find is the brooch, especially the oval or tortoise shell brooches commonly worn by Viking women to fasten their overdresses. These brooches are often discovered in graves, sometimes still holding together fragments of cloth. Crafted in bronze, silver, or occasionally gold, many were decorated with intricate patterns, interlace, animals, or abstract designs. To modern eyes, they appear as jewelry. To the Vikings, they were functional objects as well as markers of identity and style. Some were plain, others richly decorated, reflecting the wealth and taste of the wearer. Keys, too, appear frequently. Suspended from belts, they symbolize the authority of the woman over her household. To hold the keys was to control access to food stores, chests of valuables, and the organization of domestic resources. In some graves, keys appear alongside brooches, suggesting the social recognition of a woman's role as keeper of the home. These objects, while small, reveal layers of meaning. They tell us that Viking women's authority was not only symbolic, but practical. Through textiles, they controlled production and trade. Through keys, they managed resources. Through ornaments, they displayed identity and status. The mystery deepens when we consider how these roles intersected with the broader Norse worldview. Mythology 2 places women in positions tied to weaving and fate. The Norns, figures who determined destiny, were said to spin the threads of life. The image of women at looms, creating both cloth and the symbolic fabric of existence, resonates across archaeological and literary evidence. While one is practical and the other mythic, the two mirror each other in suggestive ways. Yet archaeology rarely offers a complete picture. For every carefully preserved brooch, countless others have vanished into rust. For every loom weight discovered, thousands of textiles have decayed beyond recognition. What we know is shaped by chance, what the soil kept, what fire destroyed, what time erased. That incompleteness itself is part of the story. It reminds us that behind every artifact lay countless daily actions, unrecorded but no less real. And so, the artifacts of women's daily work and adornment are more than museum pieces. They are echoes of gestures once repeated, of choices once made, of lives once lived. To study them is to enter gently into the rhythm of Viking households. It is to hear the faint sound of weaving, to picture the glint of a bronze brooch, to imagine the quiet pride of a woman fastening the keys at her waist. Mystery lingers, of course. We do not always know the precise meanings these objects carried for their owners. We do not know all the stories of the women who wore the brooches, spun the wool, or locked the storerooms. But through these small objects, their presence endures. Archaeology does not always speak clearly, but when we listen carefully, even the quietest fragments can tell us much about the world of Viking women. Archaeology offers us the tangible, but sometimes the greatest mysteries lie in the intangible traces of culture, beliefs, rituals, and practices that leave behind only hints in the soil or echoes in the sagas. For Viking women, this intersection between material and spiritual life is particularly compelling. Their roles were not confined to the visible realm of hearth and household. Many also reached into the unseen world of gods, spirits, and fate. One of the richest areas of study concerns the ritual specialists, women who acted as mediators between people and the divine. The vulva, or seeress, is one such figure. Archaeologists have found graves containing staffs, amulets, and unusual collections of objects, which some interpret as the belongings of such women. These staffs are often long, iron-tipped, and distinct from ordinary tools. Their presence suggests ritual authority, an embodiment of knowledge and power. In the sagas, seeresses are described as traveling from household to household. They would be welcomed, fed, and given honor, for their words were believed to reveal the weave of fate. They might chant incantations, sit on a raised platform, and guide rituals intended to secure good harvests or avert disaster. These descriptions, though written centuries after the Viking Age, align intriguingly with the archaeological finds. Mystery also surrounds the ways Viking women engaged with magic and sorcery, known in Old Norse as seer. This practice, often associated with the god Odin and the goddess Freya, involved rituals of foresight, influence, and perhaps even manipulation of events. Seer carried an ambiguous reputation. It was powerful but also feared. Practitioners were sometimes regarded with awe, but also suspicion. Women were more commonly associated with its practice than men, and sagas frequently connect it to female figures. What do these rituals look like? The evidence is fragmentary. Some scholars suggest chanting, rhythmic movement, or the use of staffs and charms. Others point to the symbolic weaving of threads, a metaphor for shaping fate. Archaeology provides objects, staffs, charms, amulets, but the lived experience of these ceremonies remains beyond our reach. Still, the convergence of myth, saga, and artifacts suggests that many Viking women played active roles in the spiritual life of their communities. Even the great myths echo this theme. The Norns, those mysterious beings who wove the fates of gods and men alike, were imagined as female. Their loom was cosmic, their threads the lifelines of every living being. Though mythic, this imagery resonates with the daily lives of women, who whose weaving of cloth sustained households, armies, and ships. The symbolic overlap is striking. Women as weavers of fabric and women as weavers of destiny. Another cultural mystery lies in the role of storytelling. While sagas were eventually written down by men, oral tradition in Viking times was communal. Women, in particular, were keepers of memory within families. Around the hearth, they told stories of ancestors, recited genealogies, and passed down knowledge through song and tale. This role, though less visible in archaeology, was vital. The transmission of culture, values, and identity often depended on voices that carried history through generations. The archaeological record also hints at ritual practices involving women in funerary contexts. The Oseberg burial, with its wealth of carved objects and textiles, may itself have had ritual significance. Some scholars suggest that the tapestries found there depict ceremonial scenes, perhaps used in processions. The presence of two women, rather than one, complicates the picture. Was one a ritual leader? Was the other her companion? Or were both central figures in a symbolic performance of belief? There's also the broader mystery of how Viking women engaged with sacred landscapes. Burial sites are often placed on high ground or near waterways, suggesting a connection to natural features. Did women participate in rituals tied to these landscapes? Were certain groves, springs, or stones considered places of female-led ceremonies? Evidence is elusive, yet folklore and later traditions hint that women's spirituality was deeply tied to the land itself. What makes these mysteries so calming to consider is not the certainty of answers, but the gentle awareness of possibilities. The traces of staffs, the faint lines of tapestry fragments, the scattered beads of necklaces, they all leave us with questions that may never be fully resolved. And in that uncertainty, there's a quiet beauty. History becomes less about knowing and more about listening, more about imagining lives that unfolded in ways both familiar and strange. To picture this, imagine a winter evening in a Viking hall. A seeress arrives, her staff clinking softly as it touches the floor. She is offered a seat by the fire. The household falls quiet, children listening with wide eyes, adults waiting in expectant silence. She begins to chant, her voice low and steady, the rhythm carrying like the beat of a loom. Outside, snow drifts against the walls, muffling the world. Inside, her words shape the moment, weaving together belief and comfort. Though we cannot know the exact words, the staff in the grave, the amulet in the soil, and the sagas that linger remind us that such moments once existed. They are fragments of mystery, softened by time, but still whispering through the centuries. Not all Viking women lived the same kind of life. Just as in every society, there were differences shaped by wealth, family status, geography, and circumstance. Archaeology allows us to glimpse these contrasts. Some graves contain little more than a few beads or a plain brooch, while others reveal dazzling collections of silver, silk, and fine tools. These finds suggest a wide spectrum of experiences, from modest farm laborers to women of great wealth and influence. The simplest burials often contain workaday objects, spindle whorls for spinning, shears for cutting wool, or cooking pots. These graves tell us of women whose daily lives centered on production, textiles, food preparation, tending to animals. Their days may have been filled with labor, yet this work sustained families and enabled communities to thrive. The modest grave goods are not signs of insignificance, but reflections of practical, lived realities. By contrast, elite burials stand out with their richness. The Oseberg ship burial, for example, is perhaps the most famous. Two women were laid to rest in a lavishly furnished ship, surrounded by carved wooden sleighs, wagons, textiles, and even animal sacrifices. The artistry of the objects suggests extraordinary wealth and influence. These women may have been queens, priestesses, or leaders in their community. Their burial was not only an act of remembrance, but also a statement of power and prestige. The textiles in Oseberg, though fragile, are particularly telling. Some fragments are embroidered with silk imported from distant lands. Such material indicates extensive trade networks reaching as far as Byzantium or the Middle East. To wear or even own such cloth would have set a woman apart, marking her as someone of elevated status. Silk in a Viking grave is more than fabric. It is a symbol of access to worlds far beyond Scandinavia. Other graves also reveal luxury. In some, silver brooches are massive and intricately decorated, weighing far more than practical necessity demanded. These pieces were statements of identity and wealth. Necklaces strung with beads of amber, glass, or semi-precious stones tell similar stories. Amber may have come from the Baltic, while blue glass beads were likely imported. Each bead was not just adornment, but also a marker of connection, a sign of belonging to networks of trade and culture. Weapons in women's graves, though rarer, raise fascinating questions. A burial at Birka in Sweden, once thought to belong to a man, was later revealed through DNA testing to be that of a woman. The grave contained a full set of warrior equipment: sword, axe, arrows, and gaming pieces used for military strategy. Was she a warrior herself, or is the burial symbolic? Scholars debate, and perhaps will never fully resolve it. Yet this discovery reminds us that not all elite Viking women fit into expected molds of domesticity. Contrasting these high-status burials with more ordinary ones gives us a fuller picture of Viking society. For many women, life meant hard work in fields, kitchens, and workshops. For a smaller number, life was marked by visible power, wealth, and perhaps leadership. The coexistence of these realities is part of what makes the Viking Age so complex. We also see contrast in housing. Most Viking women lived in long houses, structures that combined living space for families and animals. The smoky air, the constant presence of labor, and the closeness of life to the natural elements shaped their daily existence. By comparison, women in elite households may have lived with greater separation from animals, larger living quarters, and more decorative surroundings. Carved beams, woven hangings, and imported goods would have marked their halls. Clothing, too, reflected these differences. Ordinary women wore wool, spun and woven at home. The colors might be muted, though natural dyes could provide reds, yellows, and blues. Elite women, however, might wear garments with embroidered trim, imported silk edging, or brooches large enough to gleam in firelight. Dress was both practical and symbolic, reflecting not only a woman's role in work, but also her family's place in society. What is striking is how these contrasts coexisted within the same cultural framework. A wealthy woman buried with silk and silver still lived in a world where other women rose at dawn to milk cows, spin wool, and tend fires. Both were Viking women. Both contributed to their societies in essential ways. Archaeology reminds us that no single story captures the whole truth. Rather, it is a tapestry of many threads, woven together, each with its own color and texture. To imagine this, picture two scenes. In one, a farm woman kneels in the yard, her hands reddened from washing wool in cold water. The air is filled with the smell of smoke from the hearth, and children cluster nearby. Her clothing is plain, her jewelry simple, but her labor sustains the household. In another hall, a wealthy woman sits beside carved beams, her gown trimmed with imported silk, her brooches heavy with silver. She speaks with authority, perhaps directing servants or advising her family on trade. Different lives, yet each equally real, each leaving traces for us to uncover centuries later. This balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between the common and the rare, gives Viking history its quiet depth. Every spindle whorl, every silver brooch, every ship burial is a part of the same world, different in scale, but connected by culture. In these contrasts, we find not division, but richness, a reminder that human lives are never uniform, but always diverse. When we step deeper into the contrasts of Viking women's experiences, it becomes clear that status shaped not only possessions, but also expectations and opportunities. Social class was not only a matter of wealth. It was also a web of duties, privileges, and constraints. For Viking women, these patterns determined much of daily rhythm and long-term destiny. Consider marriage. For most families, marriage was not primarily a romantic union, but an arrangement of property, alliance, and security. A farmer's daughter might be married to a neighbor's son to strengthen ties between households and share resources. In such unions, dowries were modest, a few household animals, land rights, or simple jewelry. Yet for women of higher standing, marriage was a stage for negotiation on a larger scale. A chieftain's daughter could bring a dowry of land, ships, or slaves, and in return might secure alliances that shaped politics across regions. These marriages were not merely personal. They were deeply public, with consequences for entire communities. Within elite households, women could act as stewards of power. Archaeological finds suggest that wealthy women sometimes held keys as part of their dress. Keys were not only practical tools for opening chests and storerooms. They were also potent symbols of authority. To wear a key at one's belt was to show control over household resources and property. A woman with keys commanded respect, and her authority extended beyond domestic chores into the realm of estate management. By contrast, ordinary women's authority was often exercised through sheer labor and presence. They controlled food storage, supervised spinning and weaving, and maintained the rhythms of life that sustained households. Their power may have been quieter, but it was nonetheless vital. Without their management, the survival of families through long winters would have been far less secure. Another arena of contrast was mobility. Wealthy women, through marriage or inheritance, might travel across seas. A bride from Norway could be married into a Danish household, carrying her dowry and her culture with her. Some women appear in sagas as traveling with their husbands on raiding or trading voyages. While the literary evidence must be read carefully, the presence of women's belongings in far-flung graves suggests that they were not always confined to home. Meanwhile, the majority of women likely lived and died in the same valleys where they were born, their lives circumscribed by land and season. Ritual and religion also revealed these divides. Elite women may have taken on priestly or ceremonial roles, especially in burial contexts. The Oseberg burial, with its array of ritual objects, has led some scholars to suggest that the women interred were religious leaders, perhaps volar, seers who held spiritual authority. In contrast, everyday religious practice among common women likely centered on household rituals, small offerings to household gods, charms for protection, and seasonal observances tied to fertility and harvest. Clothing continues to highlight difference. While a wealthy woman's attire might include imported silks or silver thread embroidery, ordinary women dressed in durable wool or linen. Yet, even in modest households, clothing was more than utility. Careful dyeing, patterns, and the gleam of a polished brooch added dignity and individuality. To put on a carefully woven tunic in the morning, to fasten it with a bronze pin, was to participate in culture, even if wealth was absent. The contrast extended even into death rituals. For the majority, burials were simple, shallow graves, modest goods, and a mound of earth. Yet for the elite, burial was performance. A ship filled with grave goods, animals sacrificed, and mounds built high upon the land. All proclaimed status to the living as much as honored the dead. These burials served to reinforce memory and power. When we compare the plain with the grand, we see not merely economic difference, but different modes of being remembered. We can imagine this difference through a quiet scene. In a small farming community, a woman is laid to rest with a spindle and a handful of beads. The mourners, dressed in simple cloaks, gather silently, their grief steady but unadorned. In another place, an elite woman's body is placed in a carved ship, the crowd watching as treasures are arranged around her. The sound of chanting fills the air, smoke rises from offerings, and the mound will stand as a landmark for generations. Both burials are deeply human, but their scales of meaning could not be more different. Trade routes also accentuated these divides. Silver dirhams from the Islamic world have been found in Scandinavia, often in hoards buried by elites. Women connected to such households might have worn necklaces heavy with foreign coins, displaying wealth and connection. Meanwhile, an ordinary woman might treasure a single glass bead, carefully passed down or traded from a merchant. Both items are tokens of trade, yet their impact on daily life differed greatly. Through all these contrasts, we must remember that Viking society was interconnected. The wealth of the elite was built upon the labor of ordinary people. The production of wool, the tending of animals, the cultivation of crops, all provided the foundation for ships, trade, and lavish burials. The ordinary and the extraordinary were not separate worlds, but two ends of the same chain, woven together in the same historical tapestry. And so, when we reflect on Viking women, it is not enough to imagine only the grandeur of ship burials or the simplicity of spindle whorls. It is in their coexistence that we see the real shape of Viking life, a world of contrasts, yet also of continuity. A wealthy woman in silk and silver and a farm woman in wool and bronze both shared the same seasons, the same winds, and the same deep connection to family and land. Their lives, while unequal in material wealth, were parallel in their humanity. As the Viking Age unfolded, the contrast between women's experiences only deepened. Wealth, land, and lineage shaped possibilities, but so too did age and reputation. A young farm girl's life could differ profoundly from that of an older matron, even if both belonged to the same household. These contrasts remind us that status was never fixed. It shifted over the course of a lifetime. For ordinary women, childhood was often brief. From a young age, girls learned the skills of spinning, weaving, tending animals, and preparing food. By the time they were in their early teens, many were already contributing significantly to the household economy. Marriage could come soon after, especially if the family sought alliances. These early transitions meant that youth was a fleeting stage, quickly replaced by adult responsibilities. In elite households, childhood might be longer and more sheltered. A daughter of a chieftain or wealthy landowner might be educated in household management, exposed to poetry, or trained in ceremonial duties. Her days may have included less physical labor, but her future was no less predetermined. She was a valuable link in chains of alliance, her marriage a matter of political calculation. Yet within these constraints, she could still wield influence, especially if she proved adept at managing wealth and people. Motherhood marked another division. For most women, childbearing was central to identity. The risks of childbirth were ever present, and survival was uncertain. Yet in surviving sagas, the image of the strong mother, one who guided children, advised husbands, and upheld family honor, is powerful. For elite women, motherhood was often tied to dynastic ambition. The birth of sons could secure inheritance, while daughters could extend alliances. Their role as mothers was thus both personal and profoundly political. Widowhood, too, offered an unexpected shift in status. Archaeological and legal evidence suggests that widows sometimes commanded significant authority. Without a husband, they could manage estates, direct servants, and even appear in legal matters. Some widows became powerful figures, their independence recognized and respected. In contrast, poorer widows may have faced hardship, relying on kin for survival. Again, the contrasts of Viking life are visible. Widowhood could bring dignity and power, or vulnerability and need. The sagas, though written centuries later, preserve echoes of these realities. Women appear not only as silent figures in the background, but as speakers, advisors, and sometimes instigators. A wife might urge her husband to seek revenge. A mother might counsel caution. A widow might safeguard family wealth. These literary depictions should not be read as literal truth, but they reflect cultural expectations that women's voices mattered, whether in public or private. Another subtle but important area of contrast lay in law. Viking law codes, preserved in later manuscripts, recognized women's rights to property inheritance, and divorce. A woman could, under certain conditions, divorce her husband and reclaim her dowry. This right set Viking women apart from many contemporaries in Europe. Yet, in practice, the reach of such rights depended on status. A wealthy woman with family support could assert her claims, while a poor woman might find herself without the power to enforce them. Thus, legal theory and lived reality diverged, mirroring the wider contrasts in society. The landscape of work also varied. On small farms, women's hands turned raw wool into garments, churned cream into butter, and dried fish for winter. Their tasks were constant, repetitive, and deeply tied to the cycles of nature. On large estates, the same tasks were distributed among servants or thralls. Elite women oversaw, directed, and managed rather than performing each task themselves. Authority took the place of physical labor. Yet in both contexts, women's work was central to survival and prosperity. Cultural memory carried these contrasts forward. To ordinary families, the memory of a hardworking woman might live in household objects, in the rhythm of daily practices passed from mother to daughter. For elites, memory was monumentalized in mounds, ships, and stories. One kind of legacy was quiet, embedded in habits and traditions. The other was public, inscribed in landscape and saga. Yet both legacies have endured, converging in the evidence we study today. To bring this to life, imagine again 2 evenings. In one hall, smoke from the hearth drifts upward. A woman bends over her spindle, her children nearby, her jewelry simple, her clothes plain. Outside, animals stir in their pens, and the winter wind hums through the timbers. Her life is ordinary, her work unending, yet her presence sustains her family. In another hall, an elite woman reclines on a carved bench. Servants bring food, torches flicker on woven hangings, and she listens as a skald recites poetry. Her gown is trimmed with silk, her brooches heavy with silver. She advises her husband on matters of trade or law. Both women close their eyes at night under the same northern stars, yet the distance between their worlds feels immense. And yet, when we stand centuries later, both lives speak with equal clarity. The contrast between plain and grand is not a division of worth, but of circumstance. Each woman lived within the boundaries of her time, shaped by family, fortune, and fate. Each contributed to the fabric of Viking society in ways both visible and invisible. It is in this spectrum, from the humblest spindle to the richest ship burial, that the full story of Viking women unfolds. The rhythm of their lives, ordinary or elite, continues to whisper through history. Their voices reach us not in shouts, but in steady echoes, woven into cloth, inscribed in law, carved into wood, and buried in earth. To listen closely is to hear the cadence of a world both distant and strangely familiar. And so, our quiet journey through the world of Viking women draws to a close. From the smoky hearths of ordinary farms to the richly furnished ship burials of the elite, we have traced a tapestry woven from threads of labor, devotion, wealth, and memory. Some women lived lives of hard, steady work, their hands shaping wool, bread, and survival. Others commanded resources, wore silver and silk, and left behind monuments that still rise from the earth. Yet all were part of the same world, breathing the same cold northern air, listening to the same winds across sea and land. When we look back, the differences are striking, but the similarities are perhaps more powerful. Whether farm woman or queen, mother or widow, child or seer, Viking women shared in the rhythm of life that bound their communities together. They greeted each dawn with tasks that sustained families. They endured winters that tested resilience, and they found moments of ritual, story, and song to make meaning of their days. In our time, far removed from theirs, the details of their world still soothe with their constancy. The steady turning of a spindle, the glow of firelight on carved wood, the sound of waves against the hull of a ship. All are fragments of a past that speaks gently to us, reminding us of continuity across centuries. Perhaps As you drift now toward rest, you might picture yourself in one of those longhouses. The air is warm with the scent of wood smoke, the flicker of firelight casting shadows across woven cloth and carved beams. Outside, the night is deep and the stars shimmer over snow or sea. Inside, life carries on, slow, steady, unhurried. The rhythm of their lives becomes the rhythm of your breath, calm and even, drawing you further towards sleep. If you have found peace in this quiet story, remember you're not alone. Others, too, are listening, resting, and letting their minds wander through history's calmer paths. If you feel so inclined, you may like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a comment sharing where and when you're listening. There's a strange and comforting thought in knowing that across distances and time zones, others are closing their eyes to the same gentle stories. Here, in this calm ending, we'll let the past slip softly back into silence. Viking women remain, not as distant figures, but as presences woven into history, steady and enduring. Let their quiet strength accompany you now as you rest. May their world of firelight, wool, silver, and silence ease you into dreams. Good night and sleep well.